Good morning. That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, choir. Gosh, this whole morning has just been beautiful to be together, to hear and remember the stories. Even in that song, we get to hear the story of God. That was awesome. What's your favorite story? I assume you have a favorite story. Maybe it's from when you were a little kid and you had this book that you always loved to go back and read, or maybe that TV show that you waited for every week, back when we had to wait a week to get our TV shows. Or maybe there's a movie that was your favorite movie and you just always were hoping for either the next one in the trilogy or whatever, but you had a story that you loved. For me, that story was Laura Ingalls Wilder. I love Laura, and I wanted to be Laura, full disclosure, but I loved this story so much, and I actually have a picture. I took my kids to Pepin, Wisconsin. I don't know if you can kind of see them there. That's the replica of Laura Ingalls' homestead when she lived in Pepin, Wisconsin. They recreated the cabin, and you can go inside and see it. It was so cool. And this is actually the second time, because the first time Jane wasn't alive yet, so we had to go back. So, yes, so that's Pepin, Wisconsin. And I just want to acknowledge this, that we have grown as a society since these stories were written in the late 1800s, that the stories do contain elements of racism and colonialism. And we just want to put that out there because we know as a society that we've just learned and we've grown about what that is. And at the same time, these stories are a story of family. Ma and Pa and Mary and Laura and little baby Carrie. Yeah, we remember the story because they were pioneers, they were adventurers, and they were risk takers. This family going against all odds to do amazing things together. I loved that. I loved that adventurous spirit. And this book is actually my favorite in the series. This is The Long Winter. I don't know if you've read those stories, but in The Long Winter, they had just settled in De Smet, South Dakota. They're one of the very first families, if not the first family there. And it was a new settlement, maybe a year old, and this horrible winter happens. And we live in Green Bay, Wisconsin. We get horrible winters, but this was like a crazy horrible winter. It was about 6 months of straight blizzards, one after another. They'd have 3 days of whiteout blizzards. Imagine no insulation in your house, no current heat, little one-pane windows. And 3 days of whiteout, and then they'd get a couple days of sunshine, and then it would happen again and again and again for 6 months. And at that time, they hadn't grown enough produce to survive a whole winter without the train coming to give them supplies. And I don't know if you've ever been to South Dakota, but there ain't no trees in South Dakota. There was no lumber to cut down for heat. They were reliant on that train to get through. And so they needed the coal. And it wasn't coming because the train couldn't get through the mountains of snow. So they were stuck out there. And they were starving. And Almanzo, who would later marry Laura, he makes a decision. He's a single guy. He had plenty of food, plenty of grain for himself for the whole season. He would have made it to June till the snow thaw. But he made a decision to take his horse and his sled and to go out in the negative 20 degrees weather. Negative 20. I just keep thinking, on a horse. And he went 20 miles, and it's South Dakota, no trees, all white, all snow, no homes, no other settlements. And he just heard that maybe there's this farm that possibly has enough grain that if they got it, it might help them get through the winter, maybe. And he just does it. He goes for it. He just starts going and hopes that he runs into this farm. Unbelievable. 20 miles he traveled, and he found it. And he brought back the grain, and he saved the town. Unbelievable. What a miracle. What a miracle. And then I keep thinking, why did he go? Why did he risk his life? He was fine. And I believe that Almanzo went because he knew he was part of a bigger story. He knew he was part of something bigger than himself. When we think of bigger stories, perhaps we think of our Bibles. This is a big story. And today we're going to look at the book of Romans. We're going to see a group of people that were facing their own kind of long winter, their own struggle. In Romans 8, it talks about suffering. So it's their own story of trouble. And we don't really know now, 2,000 years later, what that trouble was, but the Bible scholars, they guess that in 49 AD, Emperor Claudius had exiled the Jewish Christians, and now they were coming back. And there was tension between the Gentile Christians and the Jewish Christians in Rome. So, and it was significant tension. They weren't sure how they were going to be one church. That's our best guess. But what we do know is there was trouble. And I want to invite us to do something we haven't really done a whole lot here since I've been here. And that is to take out our pew Bibles together. Romans 8 is on page 800, which is a nice round number. So page 800 in this pew Bible. That way we're all looking at the same text together. We're going to do a little investigative work today in the text. So we're looking at Romans 8 on page 800. Romans 8, verse 18. And I'm going to just start by reading 18 through 23. And can you turn on your detective eyes and look for words that are difficulties, trouble, struggle? Let's look together. So I'll read this and we can follow along. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. The creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. The creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. So kind of put your finger in there, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But as we saw there, I have a list here of the words that I saw in the text that were trouble, present sufferings, creation waits, subjected to frustration, bondage to decay, groaning, pains of childbirth, groan inwardly. All of creation was waiting and groaning, like in the pains of childbirth, aching for something that was not yet here, not yet there. There was struggle, sin, decay, death, frustration, sorrow, and they were waiting for something else. Here is the list that I found in that text of the things that they were waiting for: glory, liberated, freedom, adoption to sonship. I think the text we read said adoption as sons. I apologize. Redemption of our bodies. These were the things that they're waiting for, the next thing. All of creation was hoping for something beyond this present suffering. The Roman story of suffering and hoping sat within a larger story of suffering. Because we saw in that text, it said the whole creation was groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. So we know the fall happens, and then it's just groaning. It's like, can you imagine like this undergirth of rumble? Until that thousands of years later when Paul is writing this. The Roman story of suffering is part of this groaning, this larger story of suffering. Everything leading up to this moment involved creation groaning. So we know that this story of the Romans, it was nothing new. That's why when we hold these books in our hands, we read those words and we say, I can relate to that. I get those words. That's my story. Wow, I see myself here. Because our story fits into another story, a much larger and grander story. And part of that cosmic story includes suffering. Because of these timeless words that we read, and the whole text, all of us gathered here, we see ourselves in the text. We see creation's bondage to decay, right? We see it every season, every year. We see it when the leaves fall off the trees. We see it when plants wither and die. We see it when we lose someone we love. This bondage to decay. And specifically here at PCC, or Pilgrim, we have seen frustration and groaning and waiting for something that isn't right now. Scott and I started attending here in February of last year. It's almost been a year. So cool. And we often find ourselves talking with people from church, and eventually the conversation turns to the old days of Pilgrim, the way things used to be, when the pews were more full than they are now, when the halls were full of children, your children, right? Your grandchildren, your friends, and your friends' children. The person I'm talking to ends up sharing a story of how things used to be. And there is a grief there. I can feel this grief that it's not here now. And many of you have shared that you want those days back. And that makes sense. Those days were full of joy. Those memories are great. It makes sense to want them back. But what do we do with the grief? You see, with God, suffering and sin and struggle and sorrow, they're never the whole story. And they are absolutely never the end of the story. In Romans 8:23, we read that the people were waiting for their adoption as God's children, right? Our adoption to sonship, as Paul called it. In Christ, they were children of God, but they were waiting for like a fullness of it. This thing that would happen in full glory in heaven. Perfect bodies. Yes. Perfect minds. Sinlessness. And then above all, just the wonder, perfect union with God. I think about it and I'm like, bring it. We are waiting for that too. But yeah, we're waiting for that too. Can we go back to Romans 8? And again, it was on page 800 if you lost your spot. So we just looked at verse 23 there. Now we're going to jump down to chapter 8, verse 24. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what he already has? I love that. It sounds kind of like Paul's being sarcastic. Who hopes for what he already has? Like, that doesn't make sense. But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. That's what hoping is, waiting for it patiently. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. The same way the Spirit helps us with our weakness. We do not know how we ought to pray or what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes, which we know that word means to pray for, intercedes for us with groans. Wait, what? With groans that words cannot express. The creation is groaning. We are groaning. The Spirit joins in that chorus of groaning and groans with us. He who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints in accordance with God's will. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. And the next two verses depict, they're like laden with super Christian theologies, like words that I had to go to seminary to learn what they are, so just hang on. It's a little complicated. Maybe you know what these words are. I didn't. I had to learn some things. But so verses 29 and 30 are the story arc of God. They are God's redemptive timeline. This is how he works. This is God's story in 2 verses. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. And those he called, he also justified. And those he justified, he also glorified. So if we look at what that timeline looks like, this is God's story arc of redemption from the foreknowledge, before creation even got kicking and got started. This is the timeline: creation, suffering, sin, death, burial, resurrection, new life. We see this pattern all over the place. He's like woven it into our being, woven it into creation. We talked about the fall and things dying. So we have fall, things die. Winter, they're buried, they hibernate. Spring, resurrection. Summer, new life, do it again. Fall, winter, spring, summer, and we just keep going. We see it every day. It hit me the other day that when we sleep, it's kind of like a death. I don't know what happens while I'm sleeping. And so I wake up in the morning, brand new day, creation, sin and suffering and strife. And then I go to bed and I kind of die. And then I wake up, new life, resurrection, and I do it all over again. This is the pattern. He's even designed our bodies to do the pattern. We see this in our relationships. We form a new friendship. Yay, creation, new life. Somebody sins and somebody hurts somebody. Ugh. And then there has to be a death. And it's not necessarily a physical death, but like a surrender, a letting go. And I'm sorry. And then new life, hope, forgiveness, peace, joy. Sometimes the death is releasing that friendship or that relationship, and then God brings new people and new experiences. And it follows the timeline, because this is how it works. This is the timeline we're on. This story is playing out in a cosmic scale, which we saw in our Bibles, and we see this pattern all over the place. But you see, in our humanness, we don't always work with God in the timeline, right? In our humanness, we want to get stuck at one part in the timeline, and we dig our heels in, like God is moving this timeline, like how the earth turns and it just keeps going. The timeline just keeps going like a magnet. It's pulling us toward redemption, pulling us towards the culmination of all things. And he's moving ever forward. And we want to dig in our heels and say, I don't like the death part. I don't want to do that part. I'm going to stay right here in sin and suffering, because at least it's comfortable and it doesn't mean I have to die. Or I'm going to just pretend I'm in just the creation part, of all the happy, 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 and I'm going to go la, 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 la. I don't see the sin and suffering, but we dig our heels in, and that's human, and we want to make the timeline stop because we don't like change. I don't like change. And we fight for the things that we like so they stay the same. But my friends, status quo is not on the timeline. Staying the same is not part of the redemptive process. It's just not. It is sad. It's sad that the pews aren't as full as they were. Some days I get really sad about that. I sit here and there's 10 of us and I think, oh, there could be more. And I get sad. But that's a narrow story. I have to remind myself, and I remind us today, that's a narrow story. Because God's timeline is just keeping on. It keeps moving forward, and right now at Pilgrim, new life is here. It hit me this week like a ton of bricks. God brought the world into our building. God brought the immigrant community, the ones that he calls us to love as if they're our own family in the Bible. He brought them into our building, right to our door. It makes me think of Paul and Martha Eichmann. They are my great-grandparents, and they came here from Prussia over 100 years ago and settled not far from Pepin, Wisconsin. Just saying. And that's why we got so many pictures, because we go back there. But I think of Paul and Martha. What would I have wanted for them? What would I have wanted for them when they came to America? Let me tell you, I hope somebody loved them well. I hope somebody helped them build their barn. I hope somebody taught their kids how to speak English, and that the storekeepers didn't cheat them because they didn't know English. I hope they made friends. And that makes me think of Grace of Salvation Church that's here. What could we do to love them like we would have hoped someone loved our immigrant grandparents? What does that love look like? How can we help them and make that transition easier? God brought children to fill our hallway. Literally, I've seen them fill our hallways. They're just little Catholic kids and little Russian Orthodox kids. And what would it look like if we loved them like they were ours? That's hard, because I know that some of that relationship is tense. But what does love look like? God brought the least of these. He brought Paragon Services, people that the society looks at and says, you don't have value because you can't contribute. What? Jesus sits with the least of these. What does it look like to love them, to see them? What can we do to support them? God brought people who are struggling with families and addiction. He brings Al-Anon's ministries here. Now, granted, we need to be confidential in our love there, but what does it look like to love them? They're here. The new life is here. Resurrection is here. What does love look like? It takes energy to replay old stories. I know, I do it. It takes a lot of energy to dwell on the past. But what if we just gathered up that energy and lifted our eyes and put it into loving the resurrection, the new life that's here? Instead of replaying the story, we loved the people that are here. It takes risk, because the risk is this, right? If the pews aren't full, are we going to have to close the doors because we don't have money to pay for this? That's a risk. But I trust the timeline. We trust the timeline, right? This is our story. We sang it. I'm so glad Dick picked the songs. This is our story. This is our song. Perfect submission. Yes. This is our story. This is us. We're on the timeline. So it's a risk to keep loving and keep pouring when we're not sure how it's going to go. But I want to trust him for the resurrection. and I want to be about his business. We have work to do, and we have Jesus' self-love to give. And he's given us ample opportunity here. May God grant us the eyes to see the new life that's here right now. Oh, and Spirit, please help us to let go so we can fully live in the resurrection that is here now among us. Amen.